The evening sun bled into the dusty streets of New Orleans, coating the cracked sidewalks and leaning lampposts in a burnished orange glow. On the corner of Claiborne Avenue, an old man named Elijah sat on a worn wooden chair outside his small grocery store. His back was stooped, his hands calloused, and his eyes carried decades of unspoken stories. At 74, Elijah had seen every face of injustice: the segregated buses, the whites-only signs, the long shadow of men in uniforms who spoke of law but carried hatred in their eyes. Still, he kept his head high, because he believed that dignity was the last thing they could never take from him. It was a quiet Thursday until the silence cracked. A car rolled up, its tinted windows reflecting the fading sun. The passenger door swung open, and a young man in a black hoodie stepped out. He walked with the twitchy urgency of someone who didn't belong to the moment. No greeting, no hesitation, just a flash of cold metal in his hand. The gun was aimed, and the old man barely had time to register the threat. "Old man, you've been running your mouth too long." The voice was sharp, charged with something deeper than petty crime. Elijah's breath caught, not in fear, but in disbelief. Disbelief that after all these years, the same script was playing out again. His eyes searched the young man's face, but there was nothing familiar. A gunshot split the air, loud enough to make the birds scatter from the power lines. Elijah collapsed against the chair, clutching his side. The chair tipped, the grocery door swung half open, and for a moment, it was just the sound of the wind and Elijah's slow, pained breathing. But before the young man could make his escape, the street erupted. From the shadows of a nearby alley, black SUVs roared forward. The screech of tires drowned out every other sound. Doors burst open, and men in tactical gear poured out, their boots pounding the pavement. The shooter froze, caught between the instinct to run and the realization that there was no way out. A voice boomed, "Drop your weapon, now." The gun clattered to the ground, and in seconds, he was pinned against the hood of his own car. What neither the shooter nor the onlookers knew was that this wasn't an ordinary arrest. These men weren't just police, they were part of an unmarked, undisclosed branch of federal intelligence, operating under the name Operation Badal. Their mission: to dismantle covert networks that had been quietly reigniting the fires of racial violence under new disguises. The man they had just apprehended wasn't some random thug, he was a sleeper operative, trained and placed under deep cover. And Elijah, he was more than an old man running a store, lying there on the ground. Elijah felt the world blur in and out. The sirens, the shouted commands, the crunch of boots, it all became a haze. Somewhere deep in his mind, a memory stirred. He remembered another day, another ambush 50 years earlier. Back then, he had been 24, standing on a bridge in Selma, Alabama, holding a sign that said "Freedom Now." The air had been thick with tear gas, the asphalt slick with the blood of protesters. They had beaten him until he could no longer stand, and as he lay in the dirt, he had promised himself that if he lived, he would never bow his head again. That promise had carried him through decades of quiet resistance, helping neighbors, teaching children their history, refusing to let their stories be erased. But somewhere along the way, he had learned that not every enemy wore a badge. Some wore a smile, a suit, or a HOODIE. As the medics lifted him onto a stretcher, Elijah caught sight of one of the operatives, a tall man with sharp eyes and a calm presence. Their gazes locked for a second too long. Something passed between them, recognition, though they had never met. Elijah felt it in his bones. This man knew the truth about why he had been targeted. In the hospital, under the thin white lights, the questions began. Detectives came in pairs, speaking in the clipped language of official reports. "Do you know this man? Did he threaten you before?" Elijah answered with slow, measured words. "I don't know him, but I know the story. I've seen it before." Meanwhile, in a secure federal briefing room across town, the captured shooter sat, handcuffed, silent, his jaw tight. A screen lit up with his profile: false name, false history, linked to a shadow organization known for infiltrating minority neighborhoods and inciting violence to justify heavier policing. This was the first time in months that the agency had caught one alive, and the reason was simple: they had used Elijah as bait, though not without his consent. Months earlier, the operative Elijah had locked eyes with Special Agent Marcus Hale, had approached him quietly. Marcus was a black man in his late 30s, the kind of man who carried the weight of both his badge and his heritage with equal gravity. He had told Elijah the truth. The threat wasn't random. There were whispers of a coordinated campaign targeting respected black elders, men and women, whose influence and credibility could inspire communities to stand against systemic injustice. Elijah had listened, then leaned back in his chair and said, "If I can help, I will. But don't expect me to hide behind a curtain. I've been visible my whole life. I'll stay that way." Operation Badal had been risky. The agency had positioned surveillance in the surrounding blocks, ready to move the moment the attacker revealed himself. Elijah had been briefed on the danger, but he insisted on going about his day as usual, even cracking jokes with customers while knowing what could come through the door. And when it came, when the gun was raised, Elijah didn't run, because for him, fear had never been a reason to retreat. But now, as he lay in a hospital bed with an oxygen tube at his nose, Marcus Hale stood beside him, saying, "It's not over. We got one, but the roots run deep. This was just the opening. Move." Elijah's voice was raspy, but steady. "Then don't stop now. You call it Operation Badal. I call it long overdue justice." Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. But somewhere in its heartbeat, a quiet shift was taking place. The shooter's arrest would trigger an investigation that could peel back decades of buried operations, revealing the faces of those who had traded in hate while wearing the mask of authority. For Elijah, the wound in his side was just another scar, another mark in a lifetime of surviving. But for Marcus and his team, it was the spark they needed, and in the hidden corridors of power, the enemies of justice began to whisper, realizing that the old man they had tried to silence was now the symbol of something much bigger, a reckoning they could no longer control. The rain came hard that night, washing over the city like it was trying to scrub away all its sins. Inside the federal safe house, the hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the low murmur of voices. Marcus Hale stood before a wall covered in photographs, maps, and lines of red string connecting one shadow to another. At the center was the shooter's mugshot, a face still young, but already hardened, trained for purpose. The interrogations had been slow, deliberate. The man refused to speak, his eyes fixed on the floor. But Marcus had been in this game long enough to know that silence wasn't resistance, it was calculation. Somewhere out there, the people who had sent him were deciding whether to cut their losses or silence him permanently. Time was a luxury they didn't have. In the hospital, Elijah was recovering with the stubborn dignity of someone who refused to be fragile. Word of the attack had spread quietly among the community. People came in twos and threes, bringing food, prayers, and whispers of gratitude. Elijah listened to them all, but he didn't smile much. "You can bring me casseroles," he told a young woman one afternoon, "but you'd do me more good if you stood up when they come for you." Marcus visited often, though never in uniform. One evening, he pulled a chair close and laid it out plain. "The man who shot you wasn't just a trigger, he was a message. They're testing how far they can go without anyone noticing. We trace him, we find the network." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "And what happens when you find them?" Marcus didn't blink. "We bring them into the light, all of them." Meanwhile, the investigation deepened. Forensic teams combed through encrypted drives taken from the shooter's apartment, uncovering a chilling pattern. Dozens of targets, all prominent figures in black communities across the country. Pastors, teachers, small business owners, none of them politicians or celebrities. Just everyday leaders whose quiet influence posed the kind of threat you couldn't measure in headlines, but in hearts and minds that became clear that the network wasn't new. It was an evolution of older hate groups, repackaged for the modern age. Smarter, quieter, embedded in systems meant to protect. They used coded language online, legitimate businesses as cover, and operatives who could blend into any street corner in America. They weren't trying to make a statement. They were trying to make it look like nothing at all. One breakthrough came when a partial fingerprint from the shooter's weapon matched a name, already buried in classified files. Colton Briggs, a former private security contractor with deep ties to overseas operations. Briggs had gone underground years earlier, his record scrubbed clean, resurfacing only in the fringes of far-right circles. He wasn't the leader, but he was a link, and he had a habit of recruiting young, disillusioned men for patriotic missions. Marcus assembled his team in the safe house. "We hit Briggs, we break open the door to the whole operation, but we need proof, something that ties him to the orders." Elijah, who had insisted on being briefed, leaned forward in his chair. "Then give them no choice but to show their hand," he said. "You make them come to you." It was dangerous, reckless even, but Elijah's point was sound. If they could create the illusion that he was ready to speak publicly about his attacker, the network might move to silence him again, and this time, the bait wouldn't be caught in the open. It would be surrounded. The plan was set. A local journalist, trusted by the community, would interview Elijah in the hospital. The footage would be staged to suggest he was preparing to name names, a risky piece of theater designed for the right audience. Within 48 hours, chatter spiked on the encrypted channels the team was monitoring. Phrases like loose end and cleanup appeared, always vague, but never by accident. And then, a name slipped in, Briggs. On the third night, the trap closed. A black van idled a block from the hospital, its engine barely a whisper. Under the rain inside, two men sat, one of them matching Briggs's old surveillance photos. They never saw the tactical team approach. Doors yanked open, hands forced down, the wet asphalt cold against their faces. The arrest was quiet, efficient. No public scene, no warning for the others. Back at the safe house, Briggs sat cuffed, smirking like a man who thought the game was still his. Marcus placed a folder on the table. Photographs, transaction records, transcripts. "You've been doing this too long to think we won't catch up," Marcus said. Briggs shrugged. "You think taking me down changes anything? You cut one head, two more grow back." Marcus leaned in. "Then we'll cut them all." The days that followed were a storm of intelligence gathering. Briggs, facing decades in prison, traded information for protection, not from the law, but from the very people he had worked for. His confessions peeled back layers of corruption, linking the network to money laundering through legitimate corporations, backdoor deals with corrupt officials, and an entire infrastructure designed to make violence look like chaos instead of orchestration. For Elijah, the revelations were no surprise. "They've been dressing hate in uniforms and titles since before I was born," he told Marcus. "The only difference now is, you've got proof." But proof wasn't enough. The agency needed a way to dismantle the network publicly, to strip away the anonymity that had allowed it to thrive. Weeks later, Marcus stood before a congressional oversight committee, delivering a closed-door briefing that would ignite a chain of legal and political consequences. The operation's success was classified, but within the black communities that had been targeted, word traveled faster than any headline. People knew that someone had been watching, protecting, fighting back. Elijah returned to his store months after the shooting, his steps slower but his presence unchanged. The chair was still there, worn smooth by years of sitting and talking with whoever passed by. Children waved when they saw him. Elders stopped to shake his hand. He didn't talk about the night he was shot, or the federal agents, or the name Operation Badal. He just lived visibly, proudly, because to disappear would have been the victory his enemies wanted most. Marcus visited, one last time before transferring to a different city. They stood outside the store, the sun dipping low again, the same corner where it had all begun. "We didn't get them all," Marcus admitted. Elijah nodded. "You won't, not in my lifetime. But every time you stand up, every time you pull one of them into the light, you make it harder for the next one. That's how you win, little by little, without giving up." The two men shook hands, a quiet understanding passing between them. One carried the fight in the shadows, the other in the open. But both knew it was the same war, not against a single man, but against the idea that dignity could be stolen. As Marcus walked away, Elijah settled back into his chair, watching the street with the same patient gaze he'd had for 74 years. The city was still imperfect, still scarred, but in its heartbeat was the steady rhythm of resilience. And somewhere, far from the reach of headlines, the operation continued, not as a single mission, but as a promise, because Operation Badal had never really been about taking down one shooter or one network. It was about the unshakable belief that no matter how many times you're targeted, silenced, or struck down, you rise, and in rising, you make it impossible for the world to forget that you were here, that you mattered, and that you will not be erased.